I'm going to talk about the great U.S. cannabis experiment. We are in the midst of this. I was just in Ottawa the day before talking about Canadian cannabis. They will go legal throughout the entire country in just a few months, so it's a big issue. So in the United States, currently, we have 21 states that allow medical cannabis only. We have 8, actually 9 now because of Vermont, and Washington, D.C. that allow medical and legal cannabis for recreational use. And we have 16 states that will only allow cannabidiol, just the portion of the cannabis plant that is non-psychoactive, the CBD. And cannabis is a really complex topic. It's been used for therapeutic and recreational purposes for more than 4,000 years. They've found the Egyptian mummies, young girls going through childbirth, having cannabis to help them with that pain. It is the most commonly used drug across the world, and it's a very complex plant. The plant contains more than 500 chemicals, terpenes, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, as well as more than 109. And in Israel, at the last meeting just a month ago, they said there's now 112 different cannabinoids. So it's a very complex plant, and the materials and the chemicals that are present in it are really changed based on the soil, based on the amount of light and the water that they have. So the chemicals and the ratios of these cannabinoids can be quite different based upon the way in which they're cultivated. Now, clearly, this is the face of medicinal cannabis. This is Charlotte, and she's a child who suffers with Dravet syndrome, which is irretractable epilepsy with no medication, no anti-epileptic medication has helped her. And so there's a big push for having cannabidiol oils or full extracts of cannabis for these children. The problem is that we have no good data showing that cannabis is efficacious. So I really would like to point you to this wonderful book. This is the result of the National Academies of Medicine's review of all the literature on medicinal cannabis. And they tried to characterize those studies and determine where there was sufficient evidence to say that it really appears there may be some usefulness here. And in other diseases, no, there's enough data to say, no, it is not effective for these diseases. But by far, most of them fall in the we need more research. So you can see, and I just talk about this for a moment, is they've only found conclusive evidence for the treatment of chronic pain in adults as an antiemetic for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. And we already have Marinol or dronabinol, which is synthetic THC that is FDA approved for this purpose. And then, interestingly, patient-reported reduction in spasticity in multiple sclerosis. But if you look at the evidence from a physician-graded response, they've said no, they have not seen enough evidence that it's efficacious. Pretty good evidence for its improving sleep, and of course that's one of the common things that happens with cannabis. And when somebody's going through cannabis withdrawal, insomnia and the inability to sleep is one of the major reasons people relapse after cannabis withdrawal. They also have listed many things where they find that it's ineffective or there's not enough evidence. So I recommend that you have this. It's free to download off of the internet, and it's very useful summary of everything we know about medicinal cannabis. So where are we going with cannabinoid medications? The biggest problem we have is that if you find that something is efficacious, you would like to know that if you went and got the product next week, next month, that you're getting the same product. And currently, we don't have anything like that with the cannabinoids. The most we have is dispensaries testing to make sure that things like pesticides are not present, heavy metals are not present, Mold is not there. They also are beginning to test both the potency of THC, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, the primary psychoactive compound, and in some cases they're testing the potency of the cannabidiol. And cannabidiol, or CBD, appears to be the compound that is going to have the most chance for therapeutic purposes. But unfortunately, when you have 109 or 112 cannabinoids, there are many other chemicals that may be extremely important for the therapeutic action. We know very little about many of these compounds, and they're not being monitored to see that we have a reproducible product. And that goes also for the terpenes. There's lots of interest in how the terpenes may be helping with the therapeutic use in the cannabinoids. And so the safety is well established, I believe, for cannabinoids as therapeutics, but the efficaciousness is not, and we have a lot of work to do in that area. So there's some real advantages for medical cannabis and legal cannabis to improve the availability of these therapeutics, to try to meet unmet clinical needs, to reduce the burden on conducting research. So I spent more than 25 years at the National Institute on Drug Abuse in the United States, and in order to run studies on cannabinoids to give them to human patients, and all of my research was clinical research, we had to get approval from the FDA for an investigational new drug application, just as if we were a pharmaceutical company that would need to do that. And of course, we don't have all those resources. We also had to get approval from the Drug Enforcement Agency, as well as, of course, all the ethical committees. So many times it made it quite difficult to be able to run these studies. You could do it, but it just took a lot of time and effort. I think that we also are getting improved safety of the products that are available. Unfortunately, it's very much driven by money, and the different states in the United States see huge revenues coming from the sale of cannabis. And if you look at the way they approach this, they don't include all the costs. They are very big on what revenue will be developed, but not the costs on additional emergency room visits, additional cannabis dependence treatment needs, this type of thing as well. And in the United States, one of the reasons that they have pushed legalization is to get rid of the criminal people being put in jails for just possession. That hasn't happened in a long time because we have decriminalization for individuals on personal use of the drug. So that's really not a reason to go to legalization. Now, there are consequences to these decisions, and today I'm going to focus on the first one, which is the main short-term consequence, and that's a very large increase in cannabis-impaired driving, and therefore related morbidity and mortality with traffic crashes that are related to it. In Washington State, they had medical cannabis since 2009. When they legalized cannabis in 2013, in 6 weeks, they had a 25% increase in cannabis-impaired driving, 6 weeks after legalization. Also, we are at an all-time low for perception of risk. If you talk to a young person in the United States, they will say, well, how can cannabis hurt me? You know, it's legal. They're making it a medicine. It couldn't possibly be harmful for me. And what's worse, their parents also. I have many parents say to me, I'm so happy my children are not drinking and driving. They're just smoking cannabis and driving. So there's a complete lack of understanding about the harm that cannabis has on operation of any complex machinery. So we have young people feeling no risk for using cannabis at all. We have a lot of emergency room visits from children because, unfortunately, they market cannabis in every product. You can get gummy bears, lollipops, brownies, soda with cannabis in it for all the edible market, which is increasing tremendously. Well, unfortunately, children are attracted to these gummy bears and other products that look like candy. So we have a lot of children who are getting into those products, but we also have a lot of children receiving secondhand smoke from their parents smoking cannabis, and toddlers on the ground crawling around with all of the dust and the things with cannabis as well. But you might be surprised at the adults in the emergency room. And this is because we have tourism, cannabis tourism to Colorado. And people come who've never used the drug. They don't like smoking, so they decide they'll have edibles. And they pick up a cookie and they take it. If you don't look on the bottom of the cookie says that there's 100 milligrams of THC in this cookie, and you should break it into 10 pieces. Nobody breaks a cookie into 10 pieces and eats it, so they eat the cookie and nothing happens. So they eat another cookie because they don't understand the pharmacokinetics and that the THC is going to peak much later. So by the time an hour and a half or 2 hours comes along, they've eaten 2 or 3 cookies and they are having major problems, and in many cases with psychosis. So a big issue. But also cannabis dependence treatment. Cannabis does not have the abuse liability of, say, heroin or cocaine, but it certainly has abuse liability, and it is the most common drug, and so we have more and more people ending up needing cannabis treatment. We have good cognitive treatments, but we don't have a pharmacological treatment for cannabis yet. But probably even more importantly are the long-term consequences. In my career, I studied a lot of in utero drug exposure and exposure through breast milk. We now have children exposed in utero. It is frightening. There are obstetricians in Colorado who are recommending cannabis to their patients for nausea and vomiting, despite all the literature that shows cannabis's effect on the developing brain in both the fetus and the adolescent. There was just a big news story in the U.S. this week. 70% of dispensaries in Colorado recommend to pregnant women to use cannabis. And we have excellent data showing very negative effects of in utero drug exposure. And as I mentioned, the passive exposure as well. The brain, we used to think the brain was fully developed by about 20, but now we know that the brain is still developing to the end of the 20s, maybe 28. So just at the time when many people start using cannabis and are in school, and we know it affects memory, acute memory is the big issue, but now we have, as the brain's developing, all of this cannabis exposure, and we know that the endogenous cannabinoid system, which is so critical for brain development, cannabis will affect the way the nerves grow together and make their connections. And this is a permanent change. If this is during brain development, you have this unusual connections in the brain that will stay throughout that person's life. So we're very concerned about that. And then we know that the earlier the adolescent starts smoking cannabis, anything before the age of 17, it has more effects on the developing brain. So if we look here at the brain, there's so many areas which we have a very high density of CB1 cannabinoid receptors. And CB1 receptors are G protein coupled receptors, and it turns out that the number one receptor that has the highest density in the brain is the CB1 cannabinoid receptors. So if you look here, the amygdala, oops, I better be up here. The amygdala is the reason people use cannabis because it's the center of emotion. So the euphoria that people feel, also the panic, and that can occur, the negative affect that can occur in some people with cannabis is centered here, has many CB1 cannabinoid receptor. If we look at the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, these are the areas of motor control that very much affected by cannabis is the operation of any complex equipment like driving. If we look at the hippocampus, has many CB1 cannabinoid receptors that are involved in not only appetite, a survival mechanism, is controlled by different cannabinoid systems, but also the release of hormones. We know that the CB1 cannabinoid receptors are in the head of the sperm and very much involved in fertility of the sperm being able to reach and fertilize the egg. And then once you have the fertilized egg, the endogenous cannabinoid system, very important for implantation of the fertilized egg in the uterus. So this has many cannabinoid receptors. And if we look at the hippocampus, which is the center of memory and learning, short-term memory loss is very much characteristic of cannabis. But the big difference between us and lower mammals is this huge cortex that we've developed. And that enables us to have executive function, to control everything. So what is executive function? Bringing in all of your sensory inputs from hearing, seeing, smelling. You first evaluate all the information. Is it salient? Is it something important for me to pay attention to? Then you compare it to your memory and what you think about this, what you know about what is occurring previously, and then you have to make decisions and a course of action. And cannabis affects every step of the executive function process. So this is why the CB1 cannabinoid receptors have a very high density in the cortex, and this is why driving and other complex actions are so much affected. So for this reason, it's so important to understand the pharmacology of the endogenous cannabinoid system. So we have receptors. We know about CB1 cannabinoid receptors are primarily in the brain and the cardiovascular system. CB2 receptors, very small amounts in the brain, and we don't know their function yet, but CB2 is primarily in the immune system. So there may be many approaches for therapeutic use in the immune system, like with autoimmune diseases, but we know much less about this. A lot of research is ongoing in this area, and we know that there are non-CB1, non-CB2. From our pharmacological investigations, we haven't cloned them yet. We don't know. Some of the candidates are the GPR55 receptor and the TRPV receptor may also be involved in the endogenous cannabinoid system. If you have that system, you must have neurotransmitters. Took us a lot of time to find those neurotransmitters because they are not small peptides, as many of those are. They're actually unsaturated fatty acids that are then also bound to an alcohol moiety at the end. The first one, anandamide, was named by Rafi Meshulam, who was the one to discover it, and it means bliss in Sanskrit. And this is very important in the brain, as well as there's a lot more of the 2-arachidonyl glycerol. It's in higher amounts, but we know there are many, many other neurotransmitters, other endogenous cannabinoids. And I'd like to take you through this quickly because I think it's so important to see the role that the endogenous cannabinoid system plays. So here we have the Here we have the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron, and you get an electrical impulse that comes down that has to be changed into a chemical signal to cross over to the next nerve. And you see up here in the presynaptic neuron, we have many vesicles holding neurotransmitters. They could be glutamate and excitatory neurotransmitters, or an inhibitory neurotransmitter like GABA. When the electrical impulse comes down and depolarizes the plasma membrane, these vesicles go to the membrane and release the neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. They come down, bind to their specific receptors, glutamate or GABA receptors, and then they cause second messenger system to release the endocannabinoids. And again, one reason it took us till 1990 to find them, these endocannabinoids are actually very lipophilic as fatty acids, and they are incorporated in the plasma membrane. They're not held in vesicles, and they are in the membrane, and they can be released on demand. They have a retrograde migration back to the CB1 cannabinoid receptors that are on the presynaptic neuron, and this is the important role. Once you have signaling here, you actually modulate, change, turn off the release of the other neurotransmitters. So the endogenous cannabinoid system sits above many of our other neurotransmitter systems. So a critical role for the cannabinoids. So I'm going to focus now on that big short-term consequence of cannabis use, and this is the increased morbidity and mortality that's coming with cannabis-impaired driving. So if you look here at Colorado, you will see that now 35% of all of the traffic crashes in Colorado involve cannabis, 35%. So it's a major problem. I had tried very hard. The United States government built this incredible resource. It's the world's most advanced driving simulator. You can see it's in an aircraft hangar, and you see these poles that move it along. It can go very rapidly in three-dimensional space. These are actuators that let you feel everything. So I have a portion of the drive over gravel, and you not only feel the gravel when you drive over it, you hear the crunch, crunch, crunch of the gravel. And so it's a completely surrounded 360-degree view, and it's a full car inside. So the U.S. government built it, and I tried for 10 years complaining bitterly that it was not being used to study the effects of drugs. In fact, it hadn't even been used for alcohol. And after 10 years, they said, shut up, go do the study, here's the money. So we got to do it, so it was worth it. We had to first develop a drive. I wanted a drive that was sensitive to the effects of cannabis, so we know the executive function and also the weaving, that autonomous driving that we do, but cannabis affects the weaving in the lane. And so first you have a very urban segment. At nighttime, we have people opening car doors, kids on bicycles coming out into the street, because we know that affects perception of a danger, decision-making on what you're going to do about it, and then carrying it out. Then we have an interstate segment where trucks are coming and you have to make decisions about passing cars or not. And then we have this long rural drive where you can really see the effects of cannabis on autonomous driving. This is the study. We had alcohol. We wanted to have alcohol at about a 0.05%. You know that is, I believe, what is the limit here in France. In the United States, it's 0.08. In Sweden, it's 0.02. So they have low-dose alcohol. Then they have 10 minutes to smoke their cannabis. We had two different potencies, cannabis, and we had placebo for everything and cannabis plus alcohol for everything. Then we took them at 25 minutes. There's a little delay to the peak effects in the brain for the cannabis to get to the site of action. And then they had a 45-minute drive where we evaluated many, many different aspects. And then we continued to take blood over time to do the THC concentrations. And we have very major findings I'm going to tell you quickly. The big one on alcohol is when you combine alcohol with cannabis, you significantly delay the time of the peak alcohol concentration. That's very important because the public knows I've had 2 beers, I can wait about an hour, but if you mix it with the cannabis, you will have a delayed peak and delayed effects. Why we think that occurs is because cannabis slows gastric emptying, and so therefore alcohol that's primarily absorbed in the intestine, if you delay the dumping from the stomach to the intestine, you delay the absorption and will change that peak time of alcohol. The biggest, most important thing is that when you combine alcohol with cannabis, you have significantly higher THC concentrations. So in the United States, alcohol is still #1 in driving problems, but the next is cannabis, and the biggest combination is alcohol and cannabis. So it's a very common thing now for young people. Do you know young children who are starting to experiment? It used to be tobacco, alcohol, cannabis. Now cannabis before alcohol and tobacco in the United States is the first drug they may use. Now, if we look at lateral control is that weaving in the lane, the ability to stay within your lane, and many cannabis accidents involve crossing that middle lane and hitting cars head on or going off the side of the road and hitting trees and other obstacles. So if we look at that, we were able to show, and because this was a within subject design with all the alcohol and the cannabis, we were able to calculate the amount of cannabis in the blood that produced the same kind of impairment as a 0.05 alcohol, and the amount of cannabis THC in the blood that relates to a 0.08. No matter how many interviews with the press I did on these data, and I stressed this is at the time of driving. In the United States, it takes from 1.4 to 4 hours after a stop by a policeman for erratic driving or after a crash to get the blood drawn from the driver, 1.4 to 4 hours. So I want you to see these concentrations and what happens while you wait. So we continued to draw the blood, and we were able now to have evidence. We've known it for a while, but to have actual evidence. The concentration of THC in the blood drops 74% in the first 30 minutes and 90% in the first 1.4 hours. So many times the individual can be very impaired and produce accidents, but then by the time they get the blood drawn, they're below whatever limit's been established, or maybe it's not even detectable. So this is a big problem as we go forward with more and more cannabis availability. If we look at longitudinal driving, so this has to do with your speed, your variability in speed, and the distance you keep from the car in front of you. When we look at this, we see that THC in high concentrations, it's very important, in high concentrations, tends to reduce speed and to increase the distance for the car in front of you. If you look at alcohol, it's the opposite. Alcohol tends to increase your speed and time above the speed limit, and we did find a significant interaction. But you need to look at these data carefully, because if I told you at the high concentrations, you'll see a reduction in speed, but the time that cannabis is high is very short. So in most of the time when people are driving, they're not at the very high concentrations, they're at low concentrations, so it's not affecting the speed. The alcohol will be the primary one. You can see the same thing here. The higher the THC, then the time you are below speed limit is low and bigger distance. If you look at alcohol, it's the opposite. The higher you go, the more you increase your speed. And if you look at the combination, you can see again, when there's high THC and an 0.5 alcohol, you begin to see some reduction, but most of the time the concentrations are very low. Okay, and here is a study. We worked with the International Chiefs of Police, and cannabis, the number one reason people are stopped when they're on cannabis is for speeding. So I think the data about speed need to be understood, that it's not effective until very high concentrations. Okay, 5 minutes, okay. So here I'm gonna show you, we've shown many ways, many times, that people titrate their THC dose. If you smoke or you vaporize, the individual, whether you give them a very potent cannabis or a very low potency cannabis, they will smoke it. The way in which they smoke it will get them to the place where they feel comfortable. The very first puff, and each one of these is a puff on a cannabis cigarette, they start to feel the increased heart rate and the subjective effects, and they all change. The way they smoke, as they get closer to that level where they're comfortable, they will change the way in which they smoke, and the peak comes always before the last puff, and then you can see how rapidly the THC decreases. This is our study on frequent and occasional cannabis users, and we had the same individuals smoked, vaporized, and took orally 50 milligrams of THC. These are occasional cannabis users. You can see they peak during the smoking period and how similar smoking and inhalation or vaporization are. How with the THC after oral, you have a much delayed peak and much lower concentrations. This is logarithmic. If we look at 11-hydroxy-THC, this is the first metabolite, and it's equally potent to THC, so critically contributing to all the effects. And if we look at the carboxy, that's the non-psychoactive compound, you can see that after oral administration, you will have higher carboxy concentrations. Now, these are occasional. These are less than daily cannabis users. If you look at the daily cannabis users, you will see that they carry with them a large body burden of THC. They are smoking once a day or multiple. I've had people tell me 40 times a day. And you will see that they're going to have this THC on board. They're going to peak at higher concentrations than the occasional users. The same thing with 11-hydroxy. Look at the amount of inactive metabolite. They come in at a very high concentration. We dose them, and it hardly makes a difference. Well, this we found out. For most of my career, I studied acute cannabis use. I couldn't figure out how do you study chronic cannabis use because ethically and medically, safety-wise, we would never give people as many drugs as they give themselves. So this was the big shock. We all thought the THC was out of the system in 6 or 8 hours, out of the blood. And in chronic frequent users, I can still measure THC after 30 days. I sent 2 people home still with THC in their system. So that brings up the question of, is there a marker of recent cannabis use? We've spent a lot of time trying to find markers, and we have this THC tetrahydrocannabivarin is not useful. These are very useful compounds to differentiate even in chronic frequent users when they've used recently, but they're in low prevalence. And these are the 3 that we've noted. You cannot use cannabidiol because so many medications and plant now contain a lot, but cannabigerol and cannabinol will be good markers of recent cannabis use. We said if these individuals, the same people, have so much THC on board, is it active? Yes, it's the THC that's in the brain. We studied individuals, normal, healthy controls against cannabis smokers, and we were able to show, this is a very objective measure of chronic cannabis exposure, significant downregulation in the density of the CB1 cannabinoid receptors in the brain. We kept them on our closed research unit. You can see all of the different areas of the brain where there was significant downregulation, therefore reductions in the normal function. After 30 days, we had upregulation. The brain can adapt to this change, and it was a very positive thing that they could return to their normal level of receptors. But if you still have this in the brain, does it still affect your function? We brought over equipment from Jan Ramakers, from University of Maastricht, and the shocking thing was we showed significant impairment. Here are our chronic users at baseline, no surprise. Here's our controls. 1 to 3 weeks after last cannabis use, we still had impaired, significantly impaired aspects of driving, the tracking error. And here, if you look at task controls, you also see a problem that 3 weeks later, they have not returned to normal use. Last couple of slides, tolerance. That's what people say. Well, if you use chronically, they're tolerant. I think these are great examples. If the people are not acutely intoxicated, the non-user will perform better on memory tasks than the chronic user who is not acutely intoxicated. But when they smoke cannabis, the non-user will have a steeper decline than the chronic user. And if you look at these data from ours, you will see here are our occasional smokers. They will get very high on low concentrations of THC, and the chronic users require a much greater amount of THC to get to the same subjective level they would like to. Is there a cutoff level? The Canadian government said, give me a number. What's the number? There is no number. And I show you here, this is with a measurement of 1 microgram per liter. Here your chronic frequent users, that's their THC concentration over time. Here's your occasional user. And unfortunately, many countries and states have selected 5 micrograms per liter as the limit. And you will see that here is the chronic user, and it's going to drop quite quickly, but about 17% of chronic frequent users are going to be above 5 for a long period of time. In our case, 19 hours, in Australia, a couple of days, and the people who are really impaired are going to be below 5 in a very short period of time. And so the most important way to document impaired driving, I believe, is first document the impairment by the police officer. Second, get a biological sample, and we recommend oral fluid because it can be done just at the roadside, and it will point you to the particular drug that may be producing the impairment. Just a lot of misconceptions about cannabis. That is a big problem that we have right now with the medical legalization, and just my many colleagues who've helped. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. We have time for just a couple of questions. Quelqu'un souhaite poser une question ou faire un commentaire sur cette magnifique intervention?
Many thanks to Professor Huestis for this impressive presentation. I have done 3 years ago, one comment and one question. I've done 3 years ago a special event in the Commission on Narcotic Drugs about medical marijuana, and in the opening I said, this plant is a gift of God, is a treasure full of substances that could be very useful in the new treatment in psychiatry or other matter. But we should apply not a referendum to this or court decision. We should apply the rules of science in investigating each of them. And the fact that it is so difficult to provide the cannabis for scientific purpose is really an overruling in respect to the convention. It's something that is not requested by the convention. The international convention say that the substance for scientific purpose, medical purpose, should be made available quickly and fast and without any problem. The second issue and question is that if we investigate a thing as a medicine, can we simultaneously, imagine, disseminate this in a legal way for recreational purposes? And this is such as we are discovering a new antibiotic, or we are searching for a new antibiotic. Do you make that antibiotic available in the supermarket for everyone, including children, in sweet food or other things that you mentioned here?
So your comments are right on about the medicine, and what we need is good clinical studies, well-controlled, placebo-controlled, randomized, double-blind. There were brand new studies that were just released about a month and a half ago that showed some promise for a high CBD product, a low THC product for Dravet syndrome, Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, but they weren't double-blind. The physicians who were judging the progress of the children knew who was receiving active drug. So that kind of a study is not going to move, for instance, in my country, the FDA, to move CBD out of Schedule 1, for instance. I believe very much in medicinal cannabis. I don't know if you noticed, my new academic affiliation is with the Lambert Center for the Study of Medicinal Cannabis and Hemp. I'm working with physicians to try to set up studies, good studies that will prove efficaciousness But the problem about getting a reproducible product that will be the same every time you go to get it is a huge problem. And I am not for legalization because of the effects on the developing brain. And when you have something very available, I think it will have big effects, eventually even on IQ in our countries.